Afternoon, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Amy Wolf. I'm the programming director here at the Osterville Village Library. The exciting program we have in store for you will be about historic shipwrecks that have occurred south and east of Massachusetts. The region has been called the graveyard of the North Atlantic, with over 3,000 wrecks since European sailors first began exploring the shores of the Western Atlantic. Because of the hazards experienced by ships sailing these waters, Massachusetts was the 18th century birthplace of the modern United States Coast Guard. And this presentation will include an overview of shipwrecks, their causes, and the evolution of response resources and programs. Leading this program today is Greg Ketchen, a retired U.S. Coast Guard captain who also lives in Osterville. He's a volunteer at the Coast Guard Heritage Museum located in Barnstable's old Customs House and has served as its president for the past 6 years. Before moving to the Cape, Greg's career included providing support to Massachusetts's commercial ports as a development consultant, heading operations at the New England Aquarium, and filling a wide variety of Coast Guard jobs. These included performing duties at the Coast Guard headquarters in Washington, completing assignments as chief oceanographer for the International Ice Patrol, and on faculty of the Coast Guard Academy, and serving as commander of Coast Guard Group Boston and a NATO station in Italy. He has completed graduate studies in both physical oceanography and business administration, and is a frequent lecturer on a variety of topics related to Coast Guard missions and history. So without further ado, Greg Ketchen.
Thank you. I hope I can live up to those introductions. I'm just an Osterville resident. I'm here, been here for about 16 years. Now I'm going to be talking about shipwrecks, but a little bit different twist than was just introduced. I'll talk about shipwrecks, but there was a quintessential author and historian about shipwrecks on the Cape called Bill Quinn, passed away about a decade ago. And I'm not Bill Quinn. He was a great photographer, a great historian, author, wrote many books on shipwrecks. So I'm looking at it from a little bit different perspective. Let's move up here. I'm looking at it from my experience as a rescuing people from shipwrecks and what causes shipwrecks, and looking back at some of the history and what changes have occurred in response to that. I have notes here. I'll glance every once in a while as I go along, but I tend not to want to speak from or read from a text. But having said that, shipwrecks are frankly a fairly morbid topic. They usually lead to significant loss of property and life very often. It's like giving a lecture on the best or the most dangerous plane crash or car accidents that occurred. But there's a little bit something different about shipwrecks that's intriguing. Most of them, the big ones, have led to a lot of loss of life. They've been memorialized in films forever. For songs, one just celebrated the 50th anniversary of the Edmund Fitzgerald sinking in Lake Superior. And I won't sing to you, but Gordon Lightfoot's song about that. If I were technically advanced enough, I could probably have played it here. But last time I had one while giving a talk here on lighthouses, I had the one about Eddystone Light, some of you may know, and I thought I had programmed it in, and I gave up on it, and all of a sudden, as I was talking, it came up. So maybe Gordon Lightfoot will come up here in a second. No, we don't know. So anyway, my experience, just a little bit of life experience, provides some credibility for me. As Amy said, I spent 30 years as a Coast Guard officer, and then other jobs near the waterfront and along the waterfront. Most recently, for the last decade, at the Coast Guard Historic or Heritage Museum over in Barnstable Village. Connor's here with me today, one of our volunteers. Connor, one of your responsibilities today is to, as I get close to approaching 45 minutes, just throw something at me. Why don't you practice for a second? You throwing up at me just so I know. Do you have one you can throw at me right now?
I do. Oh,
okay.
They weren't here. I don't know where they went.
Oh, that's right. That's right. I gave him some things to throw at me as I had.
Got one right here.
Okay, good. Just aim for the forehead. Movies have been a topic of, we just completed an exhibit called Coast Guard Arts and Entertainment at the museum. And I counted just a very rough count initially, about 150 feature films have been done on Coast Guard themes. Many of those are related to shipwrecks. Some are lighthouses, some are other things, but shipwrecks include things like The Finest Hours. Some of you may have seen that was a Disney film that was produced a little over a decade, about 15 years ago. I guess it was about 12 years ago. And it dealt with shipwreck off of Chatham, Mass in 1952. Heroic rescue that was done there. Fantastic film. I won't spend a lot of time talking about that one. You can see the film. I would say the film, if a 4-star movie is potentially an Academy Award winner, this is probably 3-star. I consider anything over 2 stars worth watching. This is a very good film. Disney, it was not animated. It was with Casey Affleck and Chris Pine were the 2 major actors. But that's really typical of films going from the Titanic. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the Titanic today. I think you're all familiar with that. I'll put a couple notes on the side. The Guardian, another film that has to do indirectly with shipwrecks. But at the end of today, for those that stick around, I have some exciting news too, and you'll be some of the first to glance this. There's a project we've been working on for 25 years, particularly aggressively in the last 3 years. It's really exciting. It's about to come to closure here, and I've got something to show you about that. So I am personally quite excited about that. So now I have to figure out the best way to move forward here. Okay, just mention a heritage museum. If you haven't been there before, please stop over, because I realize this in every lecture, there's much more here than I can do in 30 to 45 minutes of talk. Shipwrecks, there have been several million shipwrecks in the history of mankind. And I'm not going to go through all of them today. It just isn't enough time. Even 3,000 shipwrecks on Cape Cod, I can't get through most of those. But a lot of them are documented at the museum. And it's, as morbid as I said it seems, it's still a very interesting topic. What happened? How did it happen? What can we do to prevent it in the future? And the story of survival in some cases is inspiring. So that's at the Coast Guard Heritage Museum. If you don't know where that is, it's over in Barnstable Village on 6A on the Kings Highway there. I advertise it right now. Unfortunately, it's closed until the 1st of May. We close at Veterans Day. Just as those that live here in the Cape realize, it gets pretty dead around here in the wintertime, particularly for museums. First way, let's just start out with what's a definition. The simplest definition of shipwrecks is the destruction of a ship at sea by sinking, breaking up. Well, that's not too startling. But you know, we start to, if you get really interested in statistics and count shipwrecks, what is a shipwreck? For example, we had the Iona, which is the fast ferry coming over from Nantucket about 8 years ago now, that ran up on the breakwater going into Hyannis Harbor. Ran up hard on it. It was unfortunate. It was out of commission for several months getting repaired. Few people on board were injured, not seriously, but injured. Is that a shipwreck? Didn't sink. It was taken off. But when we say there have been 3,000 shipwrecks on Cape Cod, about 3,000, at least 3,000, I guess is the way we usually define it. And we don't know how many have been there. First of all, what is a shipwreck, first of all? Second is, some of these shipwrecks we think occurred, but there was no sign of them. Back 200 years ago, there weren't many people living at the Cape. So someone would run the ship aground. It would get broken up within hours, in some cases, or days, certainly, and wouldn't know. A ship leaving Salem in the 1700s and 1800s would leave and not come home. Where did it disappear? Was it washed under a large wave in the middle of the Pacific, or did it run aground in Cape Cod? Don't know. But there have been, it's fair to say, there have been a lot of shipwrecks here. This is the Iona. The disadvantage I have right now, I can't see what the next slide is going to be, so this maybe surprise me if it's all a sequence. This is so just talking about the Iona coming in. Let me divert for a little. We'll get back to causes of shipwrecks, but let me lead into one. One is human error or complacency. That's what happened with this shipwreck. This was going at good speed. These were very, very talented, experienced, professional. There were 2 captains on board, 2 pilots. They were outstanding. But they were complacent. They came into Hyannis Harbor literally hundreds, let's say close to thousands of times, coming over a couple of times a day from Nantucket coming into Hyannis, and had a sophisticated equipment on board. This was again 8 years ago. It was all this computer equipment, GPS, they knew, they could see exactly. But they come in so many times, there were a couple of little things that had changed since the last time we were in. There was a sailboat that they anchored, had a light on it, and a few other things. So it was a little bit of fog, but not enough really to affect them. But they pretty much thought they knew what they were doing, and they were very capable, but they became complacency. And in modern days, that's what leads to a lot of accidents. People just assume we've done this many times before, and we're good at this. And they were good at it, except they missed in this case, and they ran into the ground. If you can see by the way, for those that don't spend too much time at sea, I have, that's not a good look to have your ship up on a breakwater. Try to avoid it. You can see here, I've got, I apologize for people looking at recorded versions of this. I've got a little pointer here, but you can see the red line here was what they did. The white lines in here was the way into Hyannis Harbor. This is the breakwater right in here at the end of the red line. Again, there was a sailboat here that looked like a buoy. It was a sailboat. There were things like this are theoretically inexcusable, but you can understand how they might happen. Let's see what the next slide is. Oh, Edmund Fitzgerald. I was going to let into that by singing the song. You don't want to hear me sing. My family pays me for not singing Happy Birthday at our family parties because my voice is so terrible. But the Edmund Fitzgerald got notoriety again because in November, early November, just a few weeks ago, it celebrated its 50th anniversary. This is a case of another thing. Complacency may be one of the reasons for you have the cause for shipwrecks. Loading and carriage and failures, structural failures, are another common problem with shipwrecks. In the case of Edmund Fitzgerald, this was it was at the time the largest ship on the Great Lakes. It was coming through Lake Superior. When they passed through the narrow by Detroit and other places, St. Clair, they would actually have music blaring going through that, and it was celebrated. People would line up on the docks watching it go through, and the captain would get on and give commentary about the history of the ship and so forth. It became an event every time they came through. So it was a well-loved ship. But unfortunately, it left one day, big storm came through. It was loaded with typically what they carried, and this was what they carry in this day, is iron ore. You think iron ore it's not like a liquid. Imagine a liquid in a vessel. If it rolls over, liquid goes to one side, and kind of get unstable on one side, then it rolls back on the other side. Well, iron ore you think would stay put. Well, when you're rolling around that much, it becomes almost like a liquid. It can move, it can shift. These are pellets, so it can move around. Unfortunately, with that sort of loading, when it shifts to one side, it doesn't shift back quite as fast. And that's essentially what happened. Don't know exactly what happened with the Edmund Fitzgerald, but more than likely, it was it shifted and it sank that way and lost 26 people, I think it was, that died on board. No signs of it. Yeah.
29.
Thank you. Good. I'll try to get within 5% of most of these estimates. But it was a great vessel, well done, a secure vessel. But the reality is the ocean is unforgiving. Ocean, in this case, the Great Lakes, unforgiving. Man was not evolved. Man did not evolve. Mankind evolved to become residents on the ocean. We don't eat the raw food typically that you catch there. We don't stand up to hypothermia very well unless you're in the tropics where it's not very cold. We can tread water for a while, but not indefinitely. There are things that just do not fit. In fact, one could say that all shipwrecks are human error because we maybe shouldn't be out there to begin with. Yet I'm not that naive. We need to go out. It led to exploration. It led to movement of traffic, of people, so forth. It was very important for the expansion of mankind around the world, but it is an inherently dangerous environment. What I often tell people is if you're out there in the wintertime on a December, let's pick a little later, May, February day where the water temperature is getting very close to 35, 34 degrees, you should almost consider it's like, acid. Once you fall into that water, you've only got a few minutes to survive. Hypothermia comes on very fast, and it's tragic, but it's a reality. Turns out that in the last few centuries, most sailors couldn't swim. You say, well, that's pretty naive. Well, frankly, most sailors, when your ship goes aground or when your ship has problems, you're not within swimming distance of shore anyway. So it's a dangerous environment for many reasons. Edmund Fitzgerald, again, I'll play this by ear. As I said, one of our more important shipwrecks of all times, as you probably know, is the Poseidon. We lost some good people back then. Who was it? Red Buttons and a few others that, who else was it? Edgar, what? Organist Born. Oh, yeah, we lost him too. Same with the Titanic. We lost Leonardo DiCaprio there. It can be tragic. But it is a good topic for films. Personally, just a few things that got me interested in shipwrecks. My grandfather, great-grandfather, as it turns out, was on his way from Maine to Florida, 1952, decided to stop by in Alaska on his way south. My family has these problems with realizing that that's not quite on the way to Florida from Maine to Florida, but stopped by, took cross country to Alaska, got on a cruise ship in Vancouver, worked his way north, got further up there, and the ship hit a shoal and sank. And everyone got aboard safely, got ashore safely, but the ship, the Princess Kathleen, sank within about, it ran aground hard, so it was on a rock, and then as the tide came in, it lifted up and sank. Everyone was able to get off. And it was a fairly important, there weren't any towns nearby, but they were hacked away through woods and get back to a city and get on other cruise ships later on. But it was my first exposure to shipwrecks. Coast Guard was on scene about 2.5 hours after it sank, or after it hit the ground, and helped a little bit getting people ashore. But it was interesting. There were 300 people on board, I guess, and got all 300 off and the cruise off. So that was my first exposure to shipwrecks. Growing up, coming down to the, let me come back to this one. Not sure what happened to it. I didn't have, the other one that I remember growing up is the Longstreet. But many of you have been in the Cape for quite a while would know the Longstreet as the target ship that used to sit out off of East Ham, off north of Brewster. I would spend our summers down in Brewster. I always think as kids growing up, we could walk out to the target ship. But on the way out, I would always get distracted and the tide would come in. The reality is we could never walked out that far because the water got deep as you went out further on the sand flats. But that was a ship. That was a Liberty ship. There were, let's see if I can. The number is impressive. There's 1,700 Liberty ships built during World War II. This was one of them. It was made one trip over to Europe carrying cargo. It got back to New York, had a major storm there, and had some significant damage to it. Probably repairable, but they're cranking out so many ships, it was easier to just get rid of it and take one of the new ones coming out of the yard. So it stayed down New York to use as a target ship for a while. Then eventually, just after the war, in 1945, then moved up here to Cape Cod Bay and was used as a target ship with aircraft coming out of Otis. And then finally, about, let me say, I should remember the date, but somewhere about 20 years ago, I guess, maybe it was 96, it slipped down further into the water during a storm. And it's only visible now on rare occasions at an extremely low spring tide. You can see it pop up above it. Still out there, but that was another exposure to shipwrecks. In addition was, well, let me go to one particularly. As I said, I spent 30 years in the Coast Guard, and most of the time were great days. Some of the days were not great. It was challenging, certainly, all sorts of missions. As you know, with the Coast Guard, not just search and rescue and disaster response, but it's marine environmental protection, oceanography, which I spent quite a bit of time on, certainly law enforcement, everything from drunk boaters to drug interdiction. It was interesting, but the days that weren't good were the days where you're out trying to rescue someone and you couldn't get to them. And we became very good at that, not rescuing, they're very good at rescuing them. But one that stands in mind, I had command up in Boston. It was called Group Boston. One of my stations was in Gloucester. And a fishing vessel went out of there and it was in 1994, called the Italian Gold. 4 people on board. It came out and had just come out of Gloucester about 2 or 3 days before, just started fishing. And it was a tough time economically for them. Most of the fishermen had been out there for a while on that particular period. And they heard the storm coming on, and they decided to go back in. The Italian Gold said, we've been out here many times in storms. It's not a big issue. We'll just stay out here and get through the storm and continue fishing. Well, unfortunately, it was a tragic mistake. Big storm came through. Could have even been a rogue wave. I can discuss rogue waves at some point, another lecture, because I taught meteorology and oceanography for many years. But a large wave took them out, and almost instantly. There's a device called an EPIRB. Some of you know about it. It's an acronym for emergency position indicating radio beacon. When your ship goes down, it immediately is activated by salt water and sends a signal up to a satellite and comes back down. It tells the exact position of the ship. So an EPIRB signal came in. We knew what ship it was because it registered. It said Italian Gold. The Canadian Coast Guard was out in the area searching for another ship on one of their fixed-wing aircraft, similar to ours, but they were closer. They flew down with the C-130, flew over, and they could see the Italian Gold turtle, as we call it, that turned over completely. Couldn't see anyone in the water. We were out there within minutes after that from the air station on Cape Cod. And by that time, there was nothing left. And searched for another 3 or 4 days, nothing found at all. A couple little bits of debris. And it was this is what was eventually found. The Italian Gold sunk. None of the 4 people were ever found or recovered. Bodies weren't recovered. But those are days that are not the best days of your life. I had spent quite a bit of time up in Gloucester meeting with a family, talking about what was going on. Now, these families are fishing families. They understand the risk of going to sea. They were very sad about losing it, but when we finally had to call off the search, they weren't ones to say, you need to keep searching forever. They said, thank you, you've done a great job. We really appreciate it. We understand they're gone. We've lost, probably many of them lost other family members over the last generations. So we did that at the station in Gloucester. Then as a group, when my wife and I and other fishermen's family walked up to the cathedral and had a service for them up there. That's nice to do, but it was very emotional to get involved at that level, but something was appropriate to do. I understand, frankly, after that, the Thor Weiss then sued the shipyard for inappropriate repair and sued the owner of the boat too. Got some money, not enough to compensate for the loss of their loved ones. But the Italian Gold was one that will stick in my mind forever as not the best day we had. There were a lot of good days intermingled with that. I've also been up in the Arctic on icebreakers, and I've run aground there, not a shipwreck by my earlier definition. Remember one time we were coming out of a fjord up in northern Greenland and looking for what's called a sill at the mouth of the fjord. Sill is where the stuff is pushed up and kind of build up a shallow area, usually 30 or 40 meters deep. We came up to that, and in this case, it wasn't the sill. There was a rock sticking up and ran aground there. Hard aground. I mean, we came to a dead stop. An icebreaker is a pretty good sized vessel within several feet. Tragically, we flooded one of our compartments that had all our toilet paper in it. Something that was really too bad. But we survived. We got through. Got it off the ledge. Let me just quickly go through here. Why are there shipwrecks? I mentioned human error. That involves everything from training to just making wrong decisions about when you should go out. Listen to a forecast act, and as we said with the Italian Gold, just wrong decisions made. Mother Nature, certainly weather, waves. I'll go into it just because I'm a oceanographer, a physical oceanographer. I need to spend 2 minutes on waves for a second. I'll get to that in a minute. I feel an obligation to that. Equipment failure. Some of this equipment design, as we've evolved and we've learned from previous disasters, what we can do better to inspecting. That's one of the Coast Guard's responsibilities, inspecting vessels and making sure that they are they're going to hold up to the most common disasters. You can never be ready for everything. That's a reality. Collisions, again, that's human error typically, usually not good. I'll show you one example. What I'm going to get to here in a second is some specific examples of shipwrecks that fit into this. Hostility, certainly, wartime. Our biggest marine disaster, where we've lost most people, is during wartime, as you might expect. Hostility, coastal hazards, navigation up until the early mid-1700s. Navigation was, to say the least, very poor. One element was not able to be calculated well, is longitude. Latitude you could do with the stars. If it was not a foggy night, you could see stars or see during the day where the sun was, and you could calculate with some degree of accuracy what your latitude. That tells how far east and west you are. But north and south was a different story. That was longitude. And a guy named Harrison invented the chronometer, because to do that calculation using celestial navigation, you need to know the time precisely compared back to Greenwich, because in Greenwich they'd observed the stars there and they knew the accuracy there, so you could do calculations. I won't go through the whole thing right now. It's not terrible. It takes a little bit of training to do celestial navigation, but that didn't exist. Longitude you couldn't. So you could come across the come across the Atlantic Ocean, for example, from Europe, and you could pretty much tell when you were going to encounter land, but not necessarily where on the land. Are you going to land up in Maine, or are you going to land in Virginia? They could get maybe a little bit closer than that, but it was hard to understand. Certainly now, coastal hazards, well mapped, charted, GPS and so forth allow you to know where you are. But that goes back again to complacency. You think you know where you are, you feel comfortable until something happens. Improper cargo storage. There are many examples there. One I just gave with the Edmund Fitzgerald, where the cargo just shifts. By the way, there used to carry a lot of, one of the cargoes that was dangerous was guano that would take out of the mines, particularly in Central America, or from bat guano. Use that for fertilizer. It's very, very good nitrogen. But there was an expression called, well, to be indiscreet, SHIT, ship high in transit, was what theoretically that would stand for. It has other meanings too, but essentially it is guano. And SHIT meant keep it high in a ship where the gas can leak out well and not low in a vessel, or the ship will blow up, which happened a number of times. Graveyards of the North Atlantic. I'll just spend a few more minutes on that. You can see several here. Obviously, we're in this area here, particularly Cape Cod. This is Sable Island out here, just an island sitting in the middle of the North Atlantic that just there is a kind of a target for people going by to run into, and they did. We're here, obviously, and down through New York is one of the graveyards, particularly Cape Cod. To get down to Cape Hatteras, just extreme weather. And down here, a high traffic area, too, with particularly during the 16s and 1700s, a couple of people coming back here with cargo of gold and other riches that would be pilfering down there. And then going through the Bahamas was particularly tricky without maps and so forth. And very likely to get a hurricane to come through, which didn't help the situation at all. Said what makes a graveyard? I said that topography and bathymetry, not having good charts, heavy marine traffic, particularly in the case of Cape Cod. This was the interstate highway system off Cape Cod. Traffic coming down from Salem, Boston, going down to New York and Norfolk and Savannah and places like that. Just came all around Cape Cod and not only caused ships to run into each other, but more importantly, I'll show you just in a second about bad weather. Let's see if that's the next one. Now, how can this be dangerous? Nice little waves coming in. For those that haven't been at sea, you know, your ship you run aground 100 yards offshore in the middle of winter time, I mean, let's say 200 yards offshore. In the middle of winter time, you're not going to be able to swim ashore. Let's think of swimming when the temperature is 30 some odd degrees in the water, trying to swim ashore 200 yards, the length of 2 football fields. You're not going to live. So you had to get some way to get ashore. If there's big waves coming in, those waves are extremely powerful. It hit the side of the ship and it breaks them apart much faster than you would expect. Not a matter of days, in a matter of hours or even less, you can lose people. So your typical summer day, if you ran aground here, you'd be all right. You could wade ashore. I have a lot of friends in the Navy. The Navy and the Coast Guard are very close together. The Coast Guard's over in the Homeland Security Department. The Navy's under the Department of whatever we call it today, Defense, War, whatever. But my Navy friends say that, oh, in a Coast Guard, you have to be over 6 feet tall. So if your ship goes down, you can wade ashore. Yeah, they know better than that. For example, as Amy pointed out, I spent a year over in command of a NATO station in the Mediterranean. Spent a lot of time on glaciers, studying glaciers on the coast of Greenland. So it was it's not quite as simple as being able to wade ashore. This is just a quick look at the interstate highway system. This is the main channel today coming down. This is a treacherous area down here, south of Nantucket, with the shipping, with all the shoals that exist there. In fact, as we'll see in a second, I think the next slide will show it. What happened is most of the ships would try to get down through here and avoid going down here. So this was well marked with buoys and light ships. Another topic I've given a talk on light ships alone is interesting. One of the most dangerous occupations the Coast Guard had at the time was being on a light ship. So that's a heavy traffic area. Yes, yep.
So I mean, I look at when I used to have a boat.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah, I love watching the whale boat because I mean, it always seemed like that channel was always shifting and changing. If you go to Sandy Neck, it would look different every single year. with all the storms that we had, how often do they update those? Because, I mean, from year to year, even if you look at chat, it'd be very helpful.
Well, fortunately, with GPS, they can update them fairly fast. And in the old days, when you had to print out the chart, it was not quite as frequent. Let me digress for a second here about Barnstable Harbor. Barnstable Harbor, for those that know it, I assume most of you have been over there before, is primarily used for recreational boats now and whale watch boats and tour boats. Back prior to the turn of the century, being 19 into late 1800s and so forth, it was a significant port. It was one of the more important second-tier ports in New England. It wasn't a Boston or Salem or New Bedford, but it was a major port. And what happened is, just as you point out, the big storms will come through and fill it in, they'll dredge it out, but eventually the major products they're providing started to disappear, such as glass, with sandwich glass going under. And believe it or not, a large product from the Cape was lumber. And they cut down all the trees, that industry disappeared. And there are many other industries that disappeared. So then finally several storms came through and filled in the harbor then, and it just wasn't worth doing the redredging. There was a long commercial pier that went out from there that accommodated traffic, the transatlantic traffic. You never see the ships like you see today with the large container ships obviously coming there, but you have large ships coming there. So I sort of didn't answer your question. I did wrong. How are we doing, Connor? What's the time? I don't have a clock here. Okay, I'll try to go for at least in time for questions. I need to throw some oceanography in here for a second. Nor'easters, and we're about to get one maybe, as you point out, on Tuesday, maybe it might be a nor'easter coming through. A nor'easter is basically, as you know, it's a wind coming out of the northeast, strangely enough. But what happens is you get a low pressure coming in just offshore, and because of something called Coriolis circulation effect, the circulation tends to go in a counterclockwise rotation. So as you get a low sitting off here, particularly just off the continental shelf, or just on the continental shelf, the winds will come along down through here. And there are two things that drive waves, three things that drive waves: duration, meaning the time that the wind acts on the water, speed of the wind, it's not a surprise, and something called fetch, the direction. If you have a direction of one direction for an extended period of time, the waves will build up to be enormous. I mean, 60, 100 feet in extreme cases. I mean, that doesn't happen very often. So you get nor'easter winds down here. The reason I point that out is when you have traffic coming up from New York and Norfolk going up here off the Cape Cod, and you're in a square rigger. For those that do sailing, you know, you can go into the wind some, but depending on your sails, it's hard, particularly with a square rigger. You can't go very far into the wind. So as you're coming up here, if you get caught here, you just can't go to the right. The wind's blowing you on, so you tend up to end up here on Cape Cod, on the shoals. It had, let me find this quote. It's just an interesting way they said it. I don't see it obviously here, but one of the things that the U.S. Life Saving Service in the mid-1800s suggested is that Cape Cod is one of the most dangerous areas to transit on the East Coast coming through here because of this weather situation. The other thing is that the weather situation, I hate to be indiscreet again, maybe you've heard it, but the F in Fagawi is not so much for fog, although it is a fog situation. The fog is a factor too, particularly when you're looking for buoys and looking for other things. Fog, and between the fog and the wind and the shoals, it's particularly dangerous. It's like a quiz here, going through and not knowing what the next slide is going to be. You can see the blue areas here are shoal areas or narrow areas. So you can see how a ship coming down from Boston would have to kind of, this is Chatham up in here, by the way, this is where we are over here. Come down through here and work the way down through and down that way on the other side of Martha's Vineyard. It was tricky to say the least. This was called Light Ship Alley. Light ships are essentially lighthouses, floating lighthouses, as they can't build in these shoal waters out there, can't build a lighthouse there. So they put light ships out there with light on top. It was a challenging duty. They'd leave them out there. In the early days, they'd be out there for 5 or 6 months at a time. They'd leave them out for the winter. I'll give one example of what happened, a tragic example that happened there in a few minutes. So ships would come down through. It's a very common, there would be thousands of ships come through in a short period. I mean, this is a very high traffic area. I have a number here, I forget off the top of my head, but an extreme number of ships that would go through here regularly. Again, this was the interstate highway system. We didn't have I-95 and the rest of it. This is how the merchant traffic was moving around. All right, this is going to some of the history of shipwrecks. This is a Greek vessel that was about 3,000 years old that sank in the Black Sea off Bulgaria 3,000 years ago. Maybe it was BC. It's the oldest intact vessel. This is amazing. This is in about 1.5 miles of water down in a very area devoid of a lot of action and degradation. So it's amazing to see a ship that large that that is that well preserved. There's a ship that's about 2,000 years older than this was found, but the ship itself had disappeared. All its cargo was still there, so you knew it was a ship. But and there are older examples of ships. There was a about close to 10,000 years old was a canoe up in Netherlands that was found. So humans were entering into the marine environment over long periods of time. In fact, there's every evidence that much longer, much further back was the migration from Asia over to Australia into the Philippines. They didn't walk across the marine land bridges, so they had to be using canoes or rafts, probably in many cases, to get across there. Sort of like Tom Hanks in his experience. Let's cover quickly some of the things. Oldest, most deaths, richest. Richest was just found, frankly, it was the San Jose, which is a Spanish warship that came down, loaded itself with gold off Colombia, was on its way back to Spain, was encountered by the British fleet. And frankly, I don't even remember which of these was the San Jose, whether it was this one or this one, but it's one of the two there. And it sank. And about, I forget, when the last decade, maybe it's a little more than that, very recently, they found it. It has, if I have the number right, I don't mean to exaggerate, I think it's $17 billion of gold on board. $17 billion. Today's money. It was less back then, but still a lot of money. There's a lot of battle about who owns it, which country, what's going to happen there, but it's a significant amount of find. And there have been other ones, the Wida, that one here, that had a lot of gold on board. Barry has his museum now. He's built from this, and it's interesting. Barry Clifford. So there are a lot of vessels to be found out there, but they're being found much more now than they have been ever in the past for several reasons. One is technology. This is not just technology like sonar and other things and submersibles and go down and look for it. It's technology with the internet, so they can do much deeper searches for vessels, such as get on the internet and look at old historic records and give a better idea to kind of pinpoint where it might be. This is not shipwrecks. An example would be, some of you may have seen the series on Oak Island and what they've been doing up there south of Nova Scotia and trying to find gold that's on the island there, and looking back at records has been invaluable. But anyway, that's probably the richest shipwreck we've encountered so far. Let me throw in Coast Guard wide. This is 130 people on board the Tampa during World War, at the very end, in the last 2 months of World War I, and it was hit by a torpedo, and everyone on board died. Most of them, I think 111, were Coast Guard. It was the largest single loss of Coast Guard life ever in the history of the Coast Guard. So small service, but still a significant number of lost then. This was probably the largest loss of life. Close to 10,000 people were lost here. Wilhelm Gustloff was a German vessel used for the German Nazis during World War II and before to motivate people, get them on board, cruise ship that take families out and so forth. But at the end of World War II, within several months of the end of World War II, they were starting to panic, particularly up in Poland area, and people wanted to get out of there and get back to Germany. So they brought this vessel up to evacuate people, and the panic, they overcrowded by about 4 times what it should have had. Working way back down, a Russian submarine sank it, shot it and sank it because it was German, theoretically, and they said, well, there were guns on board. There were guns on board just to protect themselves. But it is now recorded as the largest loss of life of a single marine incident. Again, wartime. Throwing out wartime, there have been some others we'll get to in a second, but this doesn't even come close to some of the loss of life. For example, Kublai Khan, who was trying to invade Japan never successfully did this in the 13th century. Set one fleet over 500 vessels, lost 13,000 people. Tried it a few years later, about 7 years later, and with another vessel of another fleet of 10,000 of the ships in the fleet, and I think it was 10,000, a lot of ships, and lost 112,000 sailors. The Spanish Armada, when it went down, that was not one ship, but it lost tens of thousands in there too. So wartime, you kind of put in a different category. Civilian tragedies. The Don Paz out of the Philippines, this is just a few years ago, actually, 34, almost 40 years ago, was a ferry that was well overloaded. It was Christmas time. They ran into a tanker, it sank, and lost, again, close to 10,000 people. I don't have the exact number here. Philippines is particularly notorious, particularly in the last century. Very active. Obviously, the islands there, ferries moving around all the time. They lose, I think in the last century, without going through and looking through my notes, it's the advantage of speaking spontaneously, but it was close to 100,000 people that have been lost in ferry accidents during the last 50 years or so, because moving around a lot there. Not one incident, but many incidents. This is why I put this up here. That's the Austria, in the North Atlantic, southeast of Nova Scotia. And it was 1858, so just before the Civil War. It was coming across with a crew. I mean, it was they were carrying passengers, and they had this technique they'd use. They had a lot of pests on board, particularly rats. So they'd take oil and they'd put a hot anchor chain or something in the oil, and it'd give fumes off, and they would sort of move the rats off the ship, or would expel them for a ship. Well, what happened in this case is they're in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. They took a red hot iron chain, put it into a vat of oil, and the chain dropped out of it, set the ship on fire, and they lost most of the people on board. I mean, there was 700 or 800 people, I think, that were lost. Again, hold on, I can probably find that one. I should try to be accurate in some of these. If I can find it here. Let's not worth getting, but just say that it was there were many people lost. What many of these things do is they lead to changes. This particular one led to something called the Steamship Inspection Bureau, the U.S. setup. That led to the now Coast Guard mission with steamship, with inspections and licensing and so forth, making sure these things don't happen again. So this was a particularly tragic fire. They were way away from shore here. There was no response. I mean, they couldn't get out there. There would have been days to get out there to help out. So that's why there was such a large loss of life. Not the same as the Titanic. Well, Titanic was a different animal altogether because of the people that were on board. Speaking of the Titanic, obviously, I won't go through that story. I think you know most of it, but the Titanic, after it sank, there was something formed called the International Safety of Life at Sea Convention, SOLAS, abbreviation, Safety of Life at Sea. SOLAS Convention, within a year or so after the Titanic, I guess it was more like 2 years after the Titanic sank, they met and provided new regulations for ships going across. They included more life rafts, more drills for the passengers on board, more even line throwing guns that could be in a large tankers went across to send lines out to people to save them better. Not all these changes always worked out to be best. For example, the Eastland, which I hope to get here. How am I doing, Connor?
44.
Okay, I don't have a whole lot more time. The Eastland was a tragic example in Chicago, which I won't have time to go through, but the example was what happened there is they put more lifeboats on board the Eastland. It caused it to become unstable and flipped over and killed 800 people dockside. So some of the changes are good, some of them maybe not be quite as good. This is where the Titanic sank. I only put this one. This one's near and dear to my heart because I spent 4 years as the oceanographer for the International Ice Patrol, and their role was to track icebergs coming down from the Arctic and prevent them from interfering with transatlantic traffic. We were very successful, very proud to say. There has not been a transatlantic ship that has hit an iceberg since the Titanic. And I can feel we can take some credit for it because we put quite a bit of time. It still exists. It just recently moved from London, Connecticut, the Ice Patrol, their offices to Washington, D.C. This is the Eastland. I won't go through it, but tragic right dockside. It flipped over. You can see it looks like it's dockside. Here it is. Never left the dock, or if it did, it just barely left the dock a few feet off, flipped over. Tragic. I want to talk about shipwrecks on Cape Cod, and I want to go out and find a shipwreck or two. So I took a picture of this shipwreck, which is, well, it seemed like most of the damage was from golf balls and maybe soft ice cream. I'm not quite sure. Sparrowhawk, first European ship to be lost in America 400 years ago. I mean, sorry, 500 years ago. It was 6 years after the Mayflower. It was significantly smaller than Mayflower. It had 25 or 26 people on board as opposed to 130 or whatever it was in the Mayflower. I should note that because my ancestors were there, but there were only 4 of whatever there were on board. It got across the Atlantic, I think 40 feet long. Most of our small rescue boats are larger than that. 40 feet long, coming across the North Atlantic Ocean, ran out of water and ran out of beer. Beer was significant because that was fluid. And then they got over to Orleans and ran aground there. The captain had scurvy. He wasn't on deck, and the others didn't know how to navigate. I'd mentioned the issue of not knowing longitude and latitude necessarily very well. They ran aground in Orleans Harbor, and they were all saved. The Native Americans, they went up and spent a winter. A lot more to the story, but they spent a winter up in Plymouth and finally eventually got down to Virginia where they're headed. But the craft itself was buried in sand almost within a year or two after it went aground, and reappeared again in the 1980s. In the 1800s. And this is what it looked like. This is not a photograph, obviously a drawing, but this is the oldest relic that we have, certainly in North America, of a ship of that era. It still exists. It was over at the Maritime Museum in Hyannis for a number of years back 50 years ago now. It's now sitting up in a warehouse in Plymouth with the Plymouth Foundation people. Yes, Connor.
They are actually putting it back together and getting it on display next year.
Yeah, it's a very historic vessel from the point. There's a lot more to the history, which I won't get now to, but it was the Sparrowhawk, and it was the first shipwreck in North America. The Somerset, boy, this is a lecture on its own. I won't go into. Somerset was a man of war, a ship of the line, British during during Revolutionary War. A lot of information here. It was in Boston Harbor when Paul Revere and Bunker Hill and all that, and then it went down here and a weather got it, storm got it, washed it ashore. 420 sailors and Marines on board. 400 at least got ashore. They were captured. Captured is probably a misstatement, by the Cape Codders. There wasn't much captured, so really drenched and ready to be captured. They got them there and they marched them down the Cape and marched them up to Boston and Providence. And it was a big, Cape Codders hated the British. They're driving the economy in, and to have the Cape Cod capture this, it wasn't the Cape Codders that caught them, the Cape was the one that captured them because of the weather, get them ashore. But it's an interesting story. Just one quick side is that a good friend of mine, George Price, some of you may remember, he was the superintendent of the seashore about 20 years ago, I guess. He got a call from his secretary outside, came in and said, "George, you got a call here from the captain of the Somerset." I said, "Oh, interesting." Well, it turned out to be the captain of Somerset. It was the new Somerset, the newest one. It was a frigate out of England. And international law says now that any vessel, particularly military vessel that goes aground anywhere in the world, is still owned by that country. So although the Somerset, which you can see remnants of it here, this is off of Provincetown, this is parts of the Somerset, right, well, you can see it right here. This is has surfaced every 50 years or so. A storm will come through and cause parts of it to be surfaced, and the Park Service had taken samples of it and brought it down to their archive. Well, the captain said, he was very nice, but he says, I just want to see it. It's part of my new vessel. This new frigate that I have is named after this vessel. I want to see it. Maybe there's some sample we can display on board the ship of the original Somerset. George said, frankly, we love it being here, but it's yours. You could take the whole thing. He wasn't interested in the whole thing, but so gave back. So it was very strange when you get a call like that and you think this is really a wacko saying I'm the captain of the Somerset. City of Columbus, another lecture, a great story, tragic story, but I don't have time to go through it. I'll just show quickly. This is the path of Somerset was, the city of Columbus was on, coming out of Boston, going down to Savannah through here. unfortunately didn't get past here. 132 on board, 29 survived. The other ones all died. All the women and children on board died. Some of the men died, and it's not quite as unkind as you'd think. The men were all trying to get ready to get them overboard. The captain called everyone out on deck and said, here's what we're going to do. Here's the situation. At that point, a big wave came through and washed them all overboard. There's much, much more to the story, and it's an interesting topic on its own. I'll come back to this in just a second. This is a picture of, I'll explain this later, a picture of the Somerset going down. It's significant because the last thing I'm going to do is talking about that. Crossroad Lightship, again, another story, Nantucket Lightship. Well, let me just add to this. Nantucket Lightship is a red dot at the bottom here. That's Nantucket up there. It was out on station, and this vessel came by. This is a shot, sort of eerily, a shot taken in 1934 of the Olympic. Olympic was a sister ship identical to the Titanic. There was the Olympic, the Titanic, and the Britannic. The Britannic died, I think it was sunk during World War I, maybe. The Olympic still continued transatlantic passage. This was taken by a crew member on the lightship as it was passing by. Several months later, the same ship ran over the top of it, and half the crew was killed on the lightship as it ran over the top of it. So again, a story on its own. The Pendleton, you've all heard of. The Andrea Doria, again, interesting story. From that perspective, interesting story, because my wife's grandmother was supposed to be on the ship. She had tickets to come back from Italy on the ship. She decided to fly back instead, which is amazing to me. She was a lady that lived in 3 centuries and barely in the 19th century and just 4 years in the 20th century. But think of the fact that when she was born, Wright brothers had not even flown. Now she's over in Italy in 1956. Say, well, I think I'll just casually fly back. This is not historic at all. I mean, there was transatlantic flight, but in her lifetime, in half her lifetime, in fact, it came to the point of not having any aircraft, to just casually saying, I'm going to fly. This is a 56-year-old woman deciding to fly back. Again, the story on its own. Argo Merchant. One quick thing on Argo Merchant. It was just south of Nantucket also. Treacherous area, terrible vessel, sank with 7 million gallons of fuel oil on board. Everyone was rescued from it. Fortunately, just the grace of God, if you will, I suppose, or Mother Nature. The wind during that period was blowing offshore. All that oil went out to sea. And not that there wasn't some environmental damage out there, but certainly nothing like it would have been on Cape Cod. We probably still would have tar balls on the beach today if it had come the other way. And this is just showing, I'll leave this last thought, then get to the thing I want to show you quickly here. The ships are being found, you probably see in the news a lot, in the last decade or two, certainly with the Titanic, discovering that. The Endurance was Shackleton's boat down in the Antarctic that was recovered. This, and you can read Endurance right on the stern there. This is a ship that's over 100 years old, it's been at the bottom of the ocean. Just that technology has allowed much more advances in discovery. This is the number of people it took to discover and take photos of the Endurance, that one ship. This is the technicians and the expertise that's there. All right, birthplace of the Coast Guard. There are 3 elements of the Coast Guard in the 18th century, the late 1700s. There was search and rescue, which is the life-saving service, which started out as the Humane Society of Massachusetts, was formed in 1785. Boston Light, which is the oldest lighthouse in the country, in 1716, and the Massachusetts, which was the first revenue cutter, which led to law enforcement, 1791, built in Newburyport. All these are Massachusetts origin. All these were the organization that led to the modern Coast Guard today. So this is the birth of the Coast Guard. This is Massachusetts, the birth of the Coast Guard. So these are the 3 spots. The top up there is Newburyport, where Massachusetts was built. Boston Light and Boston Harbor, then Cohasset, where the first lifeboat station was. It is about 25 years ago, maybe 26 years ago, Ruthie Provost, some of you remember her name, she was a state rep from Sandwich area, decided that there was no memorial in the State House at all about the Coast Guard. All the other services had something there. She said, this needs to be corrected. So she had legislation she submitted and was passed to allow for a Coast Guard memorial to be put in the State House. And it passed. Of course, no funding, but it passed. And the people that are involved were either transferred out or some of them didn't get reelected. And it sort of sat without anything being done for 20 years. And about 3 years ago, several of us got together and said, this needs to get done. So we have been working on it for 3 years now, and now we finally got the image. We tried to decide what the memorial should be, a statue or an engraving or a painting. We decided on a painting to go up there, and it needed to be large, it needed to be impactful. And we looked at different versions of it. This was one. This is significant. If you remember what I showed you a few minutes ago on the City of Columbus wreck. Look in the foreground here, you can see that this vessel right here is the Dexter, revenue cutter Dexter here, helping out with the rescue. You can see boats in here from the Humane Society, Wampanoag Native Americans manning those. And then you can see a lighthouse here. Those are the three elements that eventually became the Coast Guard. Coast Guard name only goes back to 1915. Our origins we look at back in 1800s, but it was these all came together and to become the Coast Guard. This is before the Coast Guard existed. All three elements are here as the Coast Guard, so it's significant. So we thought memorial should sure show something like that. We show all three working together. So we looked at different versions of it. This one was a beautiful painting, but it was too placid. Needed more. This was a little bit too dramatic. And then we finally, working with the Peabody Essex Museum and consultants, selected the top 20 maritime artisan countries, got down to select one. It was a very, very intense competition. Selected one, a guy named Russ Crane out of Mystic, Connecticut. He started with the process, and we gave him certain directions. We want to show this. This is one of his initial sketches that was done to look at different. This was something that came later, black and white. We had to submit this through the Art Council at the State House. And this is pretty close to the final at this point. You can see the lighthouse, obviously the revenue cutter and the Humane Society. This is what the final version looks like now. This looks like it's 8 feet by 8 feet. I mean, not that money makes it, well, money used to, because I've been involved in fundraising. It's $200,000 project. It's not, this is a large painting. It is, I'm a little prejudiced, or it is, in my view, the best piece of art ever displayed in the State House. It is the last memorial put in there was about 3 decades ago. And this one is this is a classic, a masterpiece, if you will.
Where is that? It's
in the State House, just outside the Hall of Flags. You can see it being installed here. So we're putting a frame around it about 2 weeks ago. This is all just happening. In fact, the dedication unveiling is hopefully going to be next month. It is, get some idea. We had a bunch of us up there working with some professionals, unfortunately, putting this painting up. It's just phenomenal. Just the frame around the outside. Again, not to, you get what you pay for, I guess. The frame was $10,000 just for the frame because it's all hand carved. It is spectacular. This was it last week at Fenway Park. There was a football game at Fenway Park, and we displayed it on a Jumbotron there. We wanted to show it somehow there. We talked about doing a large poster or something, and my wife said, "What, are you stupid?" She's an avid Red Sox fan. I said, "Have it put up on a Jumbotron," which we were able to arrange for it to be up there. And that, let me show you then very quickly. Not that you didn't just see it, but this is the painting. It is spectacular. It's hard to tell from this because it's just a state